after the last 4 years, the United States has pursued an America First trade policy. But with the election of former Vice President Joe Biden as president, there's an expectation that U.S. trade policy will change. But in some areas, they may maintain some of the same focus as under the Trump administration. So we're here this morning to discuss what might shift and what might stay the same, and what those implications might be for the U.S.-South Korea trade economic relationship. I'm delighted to have Ambassador Chae Suk-young and Wendy Cutler here today to discuss these important topics with us. Their full bios have been emailed to you, but as many of you know, Ambassador Chae is South Korea's ambassador for economy and trade, and also a senior advisor at the law firm Lee & Co. in South Korea. Wendy Cutler is the vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the managing director of the Washington, D.C. office. As you also know, she was the lead negotiator for the United States on the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement. So, Wendy, I'd like to start with you. And when we picked this date, we didn't actually necessarily plan this out because there's no way we could have known. But we do know now that yesterday afternoon, it was announced that Katherine Tai would be the nominee designate for USTR. What can you tell us about Ms. Tai and what it might mean for President-elect Biden's trade policy?
Well, good morning to my friends in America and good evening, my friends in Korea. And I just want to thank KEI for inviting me. And I really look forward to this discussion with my good friend, Suk-young Chae. We negotiated and worked on the U.S. Korea FTA for many, many years. And I think both share a real commitment to building and strengthening the U.S. Korea economic relationship going forward. So I look forward to this discussion. Yes, Katherine Tai, I think that is just an excellent selection. She brings trade expertise to the job, but more importantly, these days, she brings a political acumen, having worked so effectively in Congress, particularly on bridging differences between all sides of both parties on the USMCA. She knows the WTO. We worked together at USTR for many years, so she knows the building. She knows how trade policy is formulated. So again, excellent choice, and she's going to be part of what I think is coming together to be an incredible team that the president-elect is putting together, particularly on the foreign policy side, where I know a lot of the other appointees. So I'm pretty excited as more and more members of this team are named.
I also would like to greet my friends in Korea and United States. And also, I thank KEI for this excellent occasion to discuss with Wendy Cutler, who is an old friend. Actually, I don't know Katherine Tai in person. I had no chance to work together with her. But when I visited Washington, D.C. Last October, on the occasion of the WTO Director General election campaign, and I had a chance to have a conference call with her and her team, and had a chance to discuss the WTO reform questions. She was so knowledgeable and informative, and we had a good discussions. I think this is good choices for the next USTR in the United States. Welcome.
Oh yeah, I think I've only heard very positive comments about this selection, so it does seem like a very strong choice by President-elect Biden. So, Wendy, just to sort of touch, briefly on what the President-elect's, trade policy might look like. Joe Biden ran on a platform of, repairing relations with U.S. allies. But one area where there's been stress in recent years is the use of the Section 232 national security procedures to place tariffs on things like steel and aluminum of U.S. allies, South Korea being one of them. How do you see the Biden administration addressing this issue?
Well, and that's a great question. And I think what I'm warning all of my kind of foreign counterparts is that I think that everyone needs to kind of temper their expectations in terms of what actions will be taken, what negotiations might be launched, what problems might be solved, and on what time frame. because when a new administration comes in, it takes time for them to build their team. President Trump is leaving the president-elect with a lot of tariffs, export controls, and other measures that will need to be reviewed. And let's also remember that we just went through, a pretty close election. And maybe we can get into later. I think that's going to present some constraints on the president-elect's ability to accomplish some of his agenda, particularly if the Senate does go Republican after the Georgia elections on January 5th. When it comes specifically to the steel and aluminum tariffs, I think there are going to be competing pressures on the incoming administration. The Biden team has emphasized the importance of working with allies and partners in lieu of kind of this go-it-alone unilateral approach followed by President Trump. But I think when it comes to trade, and his team fans out around the world and wants to talk about repairing and strengthening alliances and partnerships, a lot of our partners are going to be asking for the lifting of tariffs, specifically on steel and aluminum. The fact that President Trump used Section 232, imposed these tariffs, or in the case of Korea, negotiated quotas under the national security statute, is something that I think our trading partners still are reeling from. And so there will be that pressure. However, I think there will also be a competing pressure domestically. We need to remember that the steel industry and steel workers were strong supporters of the president-elect. Many of the states in the industrial heartland are decisive swing states. And so, the president-elect is going to face these competing pressures. I do think that there is a path forward. I think it will take some time. In my personal view is, I think, to lift these tariffs or these quotas, the Biden team would need to get something in return from our trading partners, really trying to get at the core problem that the steel tariffs and quotas were designed to alleviate, and that was Chinese overcapacity. And frankly, they really didn't help in that regard. And so I think we need to go back to what is the core objectives? What are the problems in the steel industry? How can we work with our allies and partners to ensure that China is not pursuing trade distortive measures?
So, Ambassador Che, Wendy has said, we'll need patience on some of these issues. Clearly, even beyond that, the pandemic and the issues in the U.S. economy are going to be top priorities for the Biden administration coming in. Is there concern in South Korea that these issues might get pushed to the back burner and take an extended period of time? And what types of steps would South Korea like to see the Biden administration take on trade?
Right. Actually, we welcome the Biden administration's likely trade policy platform. Actually, I can conceptualize with the 4 R's. One is the reset with allies to define common interest. Particularly, most of the allies were abandoned during the Trump administration in terms of the trade issues. We welcome this message. And secondly, U.S. will re-engage the WTO, and Korea highly appreciate the revitalization of the multilateral trading system based on the rules. And thirdly, the rationalized export control regimes, and finally, the revitalize the U.S. economy. We fully understand, actually, in the first year after take the office, the new president should focus the domestic issues. Therefore, there's competing pressures from domestic stakeholders, and also the expectations from allies would be actually different. But at least from the perspective of allies, we would like to get a clear signal of trade policy directions from the United States. we may already recognize a statement from European Union on transatlantic trade agenda between US and United States, EU and United States. They just single out the 4 priority areas. Likewise, in Asia Pacific, most of US allies are also expecting what kind of specific policy directions the US would take in Asia Pacific trade architecture. Therefore, we look forward to the policy directions, the trade policy directions of the United States as early as possible in concrete ways.
So, Wendy, keeping on this theme of the Biden administration's domestic focus, President-elect Biden ran on a campaign and his slogan was "Build Back Better." And within that, there's been talk about, more Buy American. And so some have suggested that, President-elect Biden's trade policy might not be that different from President Trump's at the end of the day. Where do you see, things, falling on the agenda for trade under the Biden administration? And what changes, if any, should we maybe expect under President-elect Biden?
Well, I think there will be some similarities, and the two I always point to is the one first that you mentioned, kind of this build back better, bringing supply chains home, building up domestic production capacity, particularly with respect to essential goods and perhaps some strategic products. But I would also emphasize that I would think that we'll also see an emphasis on establishing and strengthening secure supply chains with our allies and partners. We can't make and we shouldn't make everything at home. And if we're concerned about, let's just say, an over-reliance on China in particular, then why not work more closely with our allies and partners? So if there's another crisis, we're less subject to vulnerabilities. So that would be number one. I think the other area where there will be similarities with respect to the underlying concerns is our approach towards China. I think the Trump administration has diagnosed the problem correctly, and the Biden administration, I think, shares many of those concerns. That said, the departure will be the approach they take to those problems. And here is where the Biden team, I think, is going to put a huge emphasis on working with allies and partners to address specifically China challenges in the trade area. We're talking about unfair trade practices and practices, trade distorting practices associated with a state-run economy. And I think in this area, there are clear alignments between US and Korea. And I would hope that Korea would be one of our partners in trying to work with China to strengthen the multilateral rules in this area. So those are two areas of similarities, but again, a different in approach with respect to China. I also expect during the Biden administration, there'll be a heavy focus on climate change generally, and specifically with respect to trade, an emphasis to work with our trading partners to ensure that the trade regime also addresses climate change challenges. And I think here, this is another kind of open door for the United States and Korea to work together. And finally, I would just highlight that the Biden team has emphasized the importance of the US re-engaging and leading in international institutions and organizations. For trade, this means the World Trade Organization, Ambassador Che, he was ambassador to Geneva. He knows WTO much better than I do. But I would just say, I think this is another area where we could have just really strong cooperation and work together, again, to update our relationship through working through these other paths. The good news in all of this is no one's talking about improving or renegotiating the U.S. Korea FTA. And I think that's a relief probably to many because that has been done now in the previous two transitions. But that doesn't mean we should keep our economic relationship in a status quo type of situation. I think we need to update and strengthen our relationship, but look towards these other avenues, which I think provide an enormous amount of opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, we just before the election did a survey, and you had mentioned climate change, and if you dig into the data on our survey, because we asked people where should the United States and South Korea cooperate, if you look at self-identified Democrats, climate change was one of the top areas. I don't remember the exact number, but it's definitely something I think that there is support for amongst the public as well. Ambassador Che, speaking of collaboration, there's going to be efforts to look for areas for the United States and South Korea to work more closely. The Moon administration itself has placed a significant emphasis in its economic policy on its new Southern policy and new Northern policies for economically engaging its neighbors in Southeast Asia, those to the north, and in Central Asia. How would you describe South Korea's trade policy under the Moon administration, and where do you see the opportunities to cooperate with the United States in the Indo-Pacific, or perhaps other areas that maybe Wendy has touched on as well just now?
Yeah, actually, the Korean government faced with unprecedented circumstances from U.S.-China trade war and the rising protectionism, deglobalization, and unilateralism for the last couple of years. And this situation was further exacerbated with a strategic competition between U.S. and China in many areas, technology, human rights, and COVID responses, et cetera, et cetera. And Korea took the policies actually in responding to this kind of protectionism. They just diversified the economic cooperations with other countries. And Korea also entered into very active FTA negotiations with other countries. For example, in 2019, Korea negotiated and concluded FTA with United Kingdom, Israel, and Indonesia. And also, we're working together with other countries, Mercosur, Philippines, and EAEU countries. And we also upgraded already concluded FTA with Chile, China, and also we amended actually Korea-US FTA in order to actually expand FTA networks. And for diversification through new Southern policy and also new Northern policy, actually the RCEP negotiation and FTA with the Philippines and Indonesia are also part of new Southern policy. That was a little problem, but new Northern policy was not implemented so well because of multiple sanctions against North Korea. Therefore, the new Northern policy was designed, but the implementation is not as much as actually the government is initially expected. In the Korea-US the cooperation, both sides has also expanded economic cooperation in the fields of energy, environment, emerging technologies, such as digital and biotechnologies, and so on. The two countries held also dialogue last summer, specifically focusing on Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States and also the new Southern policy of the Republic of Korea. I think this is very encouraging. And the two countries share the view that the open and free Indo-Pacific is vital to the future of the global economy. I think that is encouraging signs.
So
if I can just add something that Suk-Young said that I think will present a challenge for the Biden administration, and that is that while the U.S. has retreated from engagement in the Asia-Pacific region in particular, we've seen many other partners in that area working together, not just Korea. I mean, Korea's FTA network is incredible and extensive, but they're not alone in this. I mean, all of the other RCEP countries came together without the United States to sign a deal a couple of weeks ago. the CPTP members have put into place the TPP agreement without the United States. That's been in force almost 2 years now. And so I think the Biden team is going to find a very different Asia than the one that was experienced during the Obama-Biden years. In Asia, where there's a lot more self-confidence, a lot more, a strong network working among themselves without the United States. And so we're going to have to spend some time rebuilding trust, listening to our allies and partners in the region about what role they would like us to play, and really trying to develop our policies and initiatives in a way that's sensitive to these changes, but also, of course, promotes our economic and foreign policy objectives. But, you know, again, it's a very different world than the world than 4 or 5 years ago. And that is going to present some challenges.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, there's been a lot that has changed since then. And, you know, there's going to be a lot, I think, that could change potentially in the near term, too. And, you know, speaking of which, you know, Ambassador Che, you know, Wendy mentioned, you know, that the TPP, while the U.S. withdrew from it, that, you know, the other remaining countries went on to, you know, do it as the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. You know, what is South Korea's interest in joining this, you know, trade agreement going forward?
Right. Actually, just as Wendy mentioned, actually in Asia, the RCEP was concluded with 15 countries, actually the minus India. And the good news is that actually the RCEP is a building block of ASEAN +1 FTA networks. And it is also symbolic meaning for the ASEAN +6 countries. And through RCEP, Korea, Japan, China conclude somewhat actually indirectly the FTAs. Currently, only Korea-China FTA exists, and Japan-China or Japan-China FTA and Korea-Japan FTA is not existing at all. Therefore, there's through RCEP, 3 countries are connected each other, and that is good news. And also, they agreed a number of provisions on TBT rules, harmonization of TBT rules, and rules of origins and trade facilitations. Although the level of ambition is very low, but key challenges is that actually the level of ambition, liberalization is very low, and the coverage is limited. Tariff elimination at 92% over 20 years. Actually, that is a very long time of tariff elimination. And this agreement, the RCEP, is lacking of the rules on areas such as digital trade and environment, state-owned enterprises, also the labor issues. Actually, they are all omitted in this agreement. That is a shortcoming of this agreement. And India is also outside of the agreement at the moment. That is not good news. And RCEP would give also positive impact to Korea because although the level of ambition is very low, but through the progressive liberalization, the participating members can benefit from the RCEP. But the benefit will be realized in the long-term actually perspective. And regarding CPTPP, the President Moon mentioned on December 8th that Korea will continue to consider joining CPTPP. That is the first ever official statement by the Korean president. I think this is quite encouraging. For Korea, RCEP, even though RCEP and CPTPP have a different level of ambitions and coverage, it is noteworthy that 7 countries are parties to both agreements, and it is imperative for Korea to join and any regional bloc whatsoever in order not to be left behind. in the liberalization of the trade. Yeah.
So, Wendy, I want to stick with CPTPP briefly for a moment. You recently put out a report, which I'd like to highlight to everyone, re-engaging the Asia Pacific on trade, a TPP roadmap for the United States. What potential options on TPP or CPTPP do you see for the United States, and what is sort of the likely path forward?
Yeah, maybe before I'd just like to touch a minute on RCEP, and I couldn't agree with what Ambassador Che said more, and that is that this is an agreement. It's easy to dismiss if you actually read the legal obligations. You can, as we say in America, you can almost drive a truck through these sentences, and it's not clear what exactly these countries are have agreed to. But all of that said, it's an important development in the region. Agreements that are based on ASEAN centrality, they tend to be renegotiated, and strengthened over time. A secretariat is created under this agreement, which I think also will underscore continued engagement under the RCEP framework. I can see supply chains being strengthened regionally, given common rules of origin and the trade facilitation provisions of the agreement. And so when I look at RCEP, I recognize it's nowhere in the league of the CPTPP ambitious provisions, but it should be taken seriously. And when you look at that agreement alongside of CPTPP in the region, if you're sitting in Washington, I think there is cause for concern. This is the fastest growing region in the world. Our engagement over the past 4 years has been, I would say, modest. And so I would hope we'd really step up our engagement. And so then I get to your question, Troy, could we, the United States, and would we, is it politically feasible for us to rejoin the CPTPP? And if so, under what conditions? And in the recent paper I drafted for and published by the Asia Society, I looked at these questions. And in that context, I surveyed and spoke to a number of current and former colleagues working on TPP to kind of get their sense, would they even want the United States back? And I was heartened to hear, yes, they do. And that was a resounding yes. But after that yes, we got to the but. And the but is, and this is kind of where my paper was kind of going, is look, if the United States does rejoin, we're not just going to be able to sign on a bottom line. We're going to be seeking updates. We're going to be seeking revisions. Some will be trade liberalizing, frankly, but I think some are going to reflect the trade policy that has been pursued over the past 4 years, with some of that embodied in the USMCA. And so the question then is, if we were interested in rejoining and we wanted to seek some revisions and updates, how extensive would they be? Would we be gutting the agreement? Would we be making it so, would the bar be so high that the other countries would think, you know what, we don't want to go down that route with the United States again? And so one of the conclusions I reached, we have a lot more work to do at home to figure out, do we want to go back into this agreement? And if so, under what conditions? And do we have the domestic support to do this? And what would we want to change in the agreement? And then also, if we do undertake domestic competitive measures and our economy is recovering, let's just say in a year or two under the Biden administration, would that pave the way for the United States to rejoin CPTPP by taking off some of the pressures that many of our industries and stakeholders and workers are putting on the White House? So I think all of these questions need to be addressed. And so where I come out on this is, given that I think this is not something that the Biden team is going to be embracing, on day one or even during the first year, does that mean we don't engage at all? And my answer is no. I think what we should do is pursue narrower sectoral agreements in the region in such areas, for example, as digital trade or medical supply chains or trade in the environment. And by doing narrower deals, particularly if we don't need congressional approval and don't need a congressional vote, there's a chance we could get them into place a lot quicker. The impact could be felt, and we could really start rebuilding trust and re-engaging in the region and hopefully building some momentum towards a more comprehensive deal if that's the way we wanted to go in the medium term.
Just responding to Wendy's actually comments right before. The Wendy's paper issued in Asia Society on this Asia Pacific regional trade architecture was quite inspiring. I learned a lot from her papers. And she just analyzed all possibilities actually, and then the conditions or the feasibilities or something like that. And at the end of actually her paper, she just mentioned that actually possibly the sectoral approach would be feasible. Maybe sectoral in plurilateral form, form could also be feasible in Asia Pacific. Again, in that sense, for example, the digital trade agreement would be made. That could be made in bilateral context, just like U.S. Japan, and also maybe another plurilateral or regional digital trade agreement can be made, joined by some other countries together. I think that is quite feasible. Otherwise, as Wendy just mentioned, that actually the Biden administration have focused domestic issues in the beginning, and the full-scale trade agenda should be put on back burner. Therefore, as an initial step to work together with allies or trading partners, I think the sectoral approach will be quite feasible. Well, Korea also welcome to that directions.
I agree with that, and I think another advantage of the sectoral approach could be is if in some area maybe it's environmental trade, environmental goods, or digital trade. The Biden administration can demonstrate that trade can be a driver for job growth in the United States. That helps politically with some of these challenges as well. But with that said, I'd like to move now and talk a little bit about the multilateral system, so to move a little bit beyond the regional side of things. Ambassador Che, the WTO obviously in recent years has faced certain challenges. It's been accused of not being equipped to handle the challenges presented by China to the international trading system. Robert Azevedo stepped down as the Director General. The United States, has basically prevented the appellate body from moving forward by blocking new judicial appointments. But South Korea has a specific stake in all of this, which is that South Korean Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee is one of the two finalists to become Director General at the WTO. How might she be able, if she's able to become Director General, manage these challenges that the multilateral system faces?
Yeah, actually, the question is very much hypothetical. Actually, so the race is not yet actually concluded. First of all, both female candidates from Korea and Nigeria advanced to the final round, proving that they are highly qualified. But the selection process is in impasse at the moment. I think we have to wait for the overall consensus by members. I think the time would tell. We have to wait for a while. I think this, as you just mentioned, multilateral trading system is virtually paralyzed. As we all know, there are three main functions of the WTO. Legislative functions. The negotiating function has been stalled for a while, and the judiciary function is totally paralyzed. Appellate body, and also even though the panel system is working, but the panel would not appeal to the appellate body. Therefore, now appeal to the void, the situation is continuing. Now this WTO dispute settlement system is now in the limbo. It's quite serious. And on top of that, the executive function of the WTO is also malfunctioning. For example, notification and then transparency clauses are not so well implemented. And also, the U.S.-China conflict has also exacerbated the functioning of the multilateral trading system. WTO in Geneva, I think this among WTO members, the trust has been evaporated. Actually, there are a little trust each other to move forward the negotiations, also to carry out the reform agenda items. If we see a number of reform proposals put forward by WTO members for last couple of years, actually there are very good proposals, and then there are also very much substantive discussions inside and outside of the WTO. For example, David Walker's proposal on the reforming an appellate body system was very much welcomed by the members, but the Walker process was not supported by United States. Therefore, even though they have achieved a lot of actually good things, but they could not deliver at the moment. And also the Ottawa process, where a number of countries, like-minded countries are participating, have discussed actually how to improve the functioning of WTO and how to carry out of the reforms. But actually, the U.S. leadership was not actually being present in both actually the process. Therefore, there are high expectations from WTO members that the U.S. new administration would show the clear leadership in the reform, in the discussion of the WTO reforms. And actually, your last question is what would be the task of new Director General if the Korean the candidate would be selected? It's quite hypothetical, but whoever would be selected, actually the new Director General of WTO would face with daunting challenges, because actually the challenges were already mentioned. Actually, challenges from inside and challenges from outside. On top of that, WTO is a member-driven organization. Therefore, WTO Director General herself could not actually reform the entire the system. Therefore, the new Director General must be good communicator, and building trust among WTO members, and then facilitator of the bridging the gaps or something like that. Yeah, I would not envy actually any new WTO Director General actually who would take the seat. Yeah,
I think it's going to be a very challenging job, whoever ends up being the ultimate candidate or winner in the race. So, Wendy, I'd like to get your thoughts as well on the international trading system. You know, given the strains that we've seen in recent years from the trade war with China, the weakening of the WTO, you know, COVID-19. You know, what are some of the reforms you see as being needed to international trade rules for, you know, trade to continue to prosper?
Mm-hmm. Well, just first on, you know, the WTO itself, clearly the DG race is on everyone's mind now. It's kind of in hiatus, I think, kind of waiting for the Biden team to come in. And I would just want to share, I go way back with Minister Yu. She's incredibly well qualified for this position. And frankly, when she first put her name in the ring, a lot of my colleagues, they didn't know her at all. I think she was, you know, better known within the Asian trade minister circles than in the WTO circles. But she ran an incredible campaign. I think she got some assistance from Ambassador Che and his contacts all around the world, in Europe and Geneva. But I think she just really impressed everyone, and no one expected her to be in you know, one of the two finalists. So it's a real testament to not only her strength and her qualifications, but to Korea as a country. The notion that, you know, the whole government got behind her and she's in a race now with another obviously well-qualified candidate. I personally think that the tide is turning, the consensus is moving to the Nigerian candidate who's also well-qualified, but we'll have to see how this plays out in the coming days. But regardless of how it comes out, I think Korea should be very proud. And I know I'm just like extremely proud of Minister Yu, who was a junior trade negotiator in the original KORUS negotiations, and now, you know, trade minister, and I'm sure, you know, she will have a very bright future, whatever she does next. I'm not going to go into all the problems of the WTO. I would just make the point that these problems didn't start with the Trump administration. They've been building up for a while. But clearly the Trump administration's attitude towards international organizations and the WTO didn't help, and they disrupted the WTO, frankly, in many areas in my regard. When I look ahead in 2021, I think in many respects, this is going to be kind of the make it or break it year for the WTO. I think it almost has some stars are aligning in 2021 for real reforms to be undertaken. One, I think we'll have a new director general. Two, you're going to have a re-engaged United States. And third, there'll probably be a ministerial meeting, which will kind of be an action forcing event, hopefully for some early deliverables coming out of the negotiating process. But all of that said, the problems are tough and the solutions are hard to find. It's an organization with 164 countries, operates on a consensus principle. So I think the challenges are enormous. But I also think that if the WTO can't start delivering results, show its relevancy by developing rules with respect to digital trade and e-commerce, with respect to non-market economies, and with respect to kind of the COVID type of measures or responses, then I think the WTO drifts into irrelevance. So again, I would hope in 2021, with a new director general, with an re-engaged United States and a ministerial coming up, that the stars could align and countries could kind of step up to the plate. And I would just conclude and say that, you know, it's not just up to the Biden administration to come in and to try and shake things up and lead everything. We're not going back to those days where the United States played that role across the board in the WTO. And, you know, I'm encouraged on this front because a lot of middle-sized countries over the past year, including Korea and Canada and others, have really stepped up to the plate in terms of coming up with ideas, proposals, you know, and suggestions for the work going forward. So if that kind of engagement continues, and if somehow we can bridge the U.S.-China difference of views in some issues, which is going to be a huge task, there are some signs of hope. Every WTO discussion I'm in, everyone gets so depressed so quickly. So at least for me this morning, I'm going to try and be the optimist.
Yeah, actually, the China issue is another difficulty is actually in moving the WTO forward because non-market economy issues is still pending in WTO, and between United States and China, actually during the Trump administration, they reached phase 1 agreement, just a kind of a purchase of some goods from United States. But the phase 2 negotiation did not start. Actually, the agenda item for phase 2 negotiation touches upon some more sensitive structural issues, including state-owned enterprises, and also the subsidy, industrial subsidy issues, etc., etc. All these issues are also linked with the reform of the WTO. I still don't know actually how Biden administration would discuss or negotiate with China together with the WTO members in WTO to deal with this kind of thorny questions. For example, the non-market economy issues and also industrial subsidy questions. Yeah.
So before turning to some audience questions, what I'd like to ask you both, maybe very quickly, if you could, is, one China issue that we haven't talked about that is going to be a challenge is, China's increasing use of, opaque trade restrictions to pressure other countries. We saw this with South Korea and THAAD. We're seeing it now with Australia over, its request for an independent WHO investigation into the origins of COVID-19 and some other issues. So I guess, to Wendy, I'd ask, what do you think the United States and its allies, should do or could do perhaps to address this issue? And then sort of similarly, Ambassador Che, what would you maybe hope the United States might do if China tries this again against South Korea? And is there a multilateral approach to this issue? And maybe we'll start with Wendy and then go to Ambassador Che.
So from my perspective, working with allies and partners, trying to address the China challenge on the economic front, that's not limited to just rulemaking and standard making. I think it also calls for coordination with respect to investment measures, with respect to export controls, and with respect to responding to some of the new measures and laws that China is putting into place. So I see that that discussion with allies and partners vis-a-vis China to be kind of multifaceted. And I think part of that discussion absolutely needs to include this whole issue of economic coercion. I think that if China concludes that it can kind of get away with imposing restrictions against a country, and the rest of the global trading community is basically quiet or just puts out a statement saying that they're concerned, what is the message to Beijing? Do they feel emboldened to do that again against other middle-sized countries? So at a minimum, and this is just from a trade perspective, I think what the WTO members should coalesce around would be really calling China out at an upcoming maybe General Council meeting, I think that takes place next week, and to using China's trade policy review to kind of call out these practices. But I think it's really the responsibility of the global trading community to send that message to China. And as they're imposing all these restrictions against Australia, you have the Chinese leadership talking about the importance of the rules-based system, the perils of protectionism, and the speaking against unilateralism and for multilateralism. So there's a real disconnect between what's being said at this level and what's being done on the ground right now to Australian imports. But today it might be Australian imports. Tomorrow, who knows?
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay, right. Actually, we are now experiencing strategic competition between U.S. and China. Against this backdrop, Korea has experienced Chinese economic coercion with a THAAD a couple of years ago, and the situation was recently a bit improved, but not entirely recovered. Still, we are suffering in many fronts. And according to the report by the Center for New American Security, actually they just issued a report on Chinese use of economic coercive measures. And there are numerous cases mentioned in this report against Japan, Norway, Philippines, Mongols, and Korea, and then now also the Australia quite recently for last 10 years. Actually, it's repeating patterns from Chinese front. Most of the steps are not consistent with the WTO rules in our view. That is kind of unilateral measures. Of course, China may insist that those measures can be legitimized by the security exceptions of the WTO. We still don't know. Actually, the language of the weaponization of independence has become a reality, particularly in East Asia. The asymmetry of interdependency could be exploited by the country, which plays the role as a hub in the value chains. For example, China and Japan would have utilized the situation because they have upper hands in the independence of supply chains. Korea suffered from China, and Korea suffered from Japan, from Japanese export control, because Japan controls more supply chains in the high-tech areas, and Korea suffering. Should there be a strong enforcement of multilateral rules, I think we can alleviate the situations, and not only from WTO, but also in G20 or APEC or other international fora, the member countries can speak out, the measures which are not consistent with the rules. Then actually the countries who would like to take economic coercive measures would have to have a second thought actually before they just introduce such measures.
Thank you. So I want to turn and try and get maybe some audience questions in as well now. So Ambassador Che, James Fothery asks, recently China and Japan indicated some interest in trying to restart the trilateral Japan, Korea, China trade negotiations. In light of RCEP, what additional liberalization might occur? And is this a viable prospect given the ongoing issues amongst all of the parties?
CJK, China, Japan, Korea FTA negotiations started already several years ago, but this tripartite negotiation was not actually making meaningful progress so far. But through RCEP, the three countries successfully concluded bilateral FTAs. Actually, before RCEP negotiation was concluded, Korea, China already concluded bilateral FTA. But through RCEP, China, Japan, and Korea, Japan concluded bilateral FTA. Although the level of liberalization is very low, there are many products which were exempted from this bilateral settings. For example, Korea carved out the tariff reduction all automobile and automobile parts between Korea and Japan FTA. Likewise, Japan-China FTA is also very low because they just carved out actually the most of sensitive product lines. Therefore, in that sense, the level is very low, but the good news is that anyway, they have a framework, they have an agreement anyway. Therefore, in the course of time, the tariff would be lowered down and the progressive liberalization would be achieved. Therefore, in that sense, this three set of bilateral FTA through RCEP could also stimulate Korea, Japan, China tripartite FTA in the long run, although it may take time.
Thank you. So I'm going to try
if I can just add, I think, I couldn't agree more. Now that RCEP is concluded, China already is moving on, talking about, reinvigorating the trilateral negotiation. And also China's, has talked also about its interest in joining CPTPP. So I think the combination of all of this really needs to be a wake-up call for the United States in that, we need to really step up our economic engagement in the region, recognizing we have, domestic issues we need to deal with. We have domestic politics we need to deal with. But I think given the team that the president-elect is bringing in on trade and foreign policy, I think we can figure this out. But again, I mean, the trilateral negotiation, everyone I'm sure in the US is looking at it saying no chance that will ever go forward. And people were very skeptical that RCEP would ever be signed. But again, I think that it's easy to say that, but once you understand the trends in the region and the economic integration that's going on, and the fact that the United States is kind of on the sidelines, I think that anything is possible, maybe not in the immediate term, but in the medium to long term.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to try and bundle a couple of questions together real quick. So Mark Mannion asks for you, Wendy. Last month, when President Biden was asked about the completion of RCEP, he implied his outreach to democracies would have a trade component. And Mark quotes, "We need to be aligned with the other democracies, another 25% or more, so that we can set the rules of the road instead of having China and others dictate outcomes because they're the only game in town." He said that we'd have a thorough plan to announce on January 21. So Mark asked, how should we interpret these statements and how much stock are you putting into them? And then one other question for you, Wendy, from Tammy Overby. The US, the EU, and Japan have a trade ministers trilateral on SEOs and subsidies. Sorry, that's actually for Ambassador Che, my apologies. Would Korea be interested in joining? And then for Wendy, what will happen to the phase 1 deals with China and Japan? That's also from Tammy. So maybe we'll start with Ambassador Che and then finish with Wendy.
Can I have the question once again? Actually,
Yeah.
I just missed it.
Sorry, my apologies because I misread that first. It's that the US, the EU, and Japan have a trade ministers trilateral on state-owned enterprises and subsidies. Would Korea be interested in joining?
Right. Actually, I'm not government officers. Actually, I could not speak on behalf of our government. But when USMCA was negotiated and concluded, actually, which contained SOE provisions, and there were also interest and concerns that USMCA provisions would become a template of U.S. trade agreement in the future. Therefore, the Korean, not only Korea, but also other countries in Asia have studied actually the provisions of the SOE issues in USMCA. There are also SOE provisions in TPP and CPTPP. And Korea studied actually the pros and cons of these provisions. And if Korea, actually, as I mentioned earlier, Korean president announced that actually Korea is considering joining the CPTPP, then that means that actually Korea should also consider accommodating all the provisions and obligations which are in the CPTPP, including SOE questions.
Wendy?
Yeah, so just quickly, the trilateral work between the US, Japan, and the EU, in my view, should be accelerated, completed, particularly when it comes to industrial subsidies, where there's some more work to do. And I think that proposal should be tabled quickly in the WTO, and those three parties should really work with others to gain support for that initiative. And I think Korea would be a natural partner in this regard. So I would hope that that work could be accelerated, escalated in importance and in the level of attention that's been given to it. It's kind of been dormant from what I can tell since last January. It's one thing to say we need to improve the rules on NMEs, but at the same time, if we haven't put any concrete proposals on the table, it's easy just to have a discussion and nothing to happen. I would just complete my remarks and say I was very heartened to hear the president-elect's response to a question in RCEP, because I think he was just right on target. That kind of the US needs to get in the game of writing these rules. So it's not that we're just not gaining the benefits from CPTPP and RCEP. It's that we're not at the table writing the rules and writing the standards and providing our input into the norms development. And this needs to change, particularly not in the WTO, but in other international organizations, and just with respect to other rule writing exercise. I think it's really important, because I think if we're on the sidelines for too long, we're going to just miss the boat of being able to influence the rules going forward.
Actually, may I? Yeah,
Yes.
actually, I misunderstood actually the questions in the beginning. The answer was not right. Actually, after hearing the comments by Wendy, yeah, actually, it's the tripartite dialogue on subsidy questions. I think now the discussion among three countries has stalled since January this year. But if United States would handle the updating of the rules on subsidy issues, actually that the issue should be brought up to the WTO. Then I think including Korea and other countries should also join in order to update the rules. Actually, the rule book is very much outdated in WTO on subsidy issues. Therefore, as just when Wendy mentioned, Korea would become a natural partner for the discussion.
You know, I have a lot more questions for both of you. The audience, I know, has a lot more questions for both of you. Unfortunately, you know, we are out of time, but I would just like to express my thanks to both of you. This has been a really great discussion. It's always a pleasure seeing both of you and talking with you. So I hope we can do this again, but thank you both very much. And thank you to everyone for taking part today.
Thanks.
Thank you.